Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's ShareNett event. I am Ian Kenyon with Cavendish Global, a partner on today's event and one of your moderators. Before we jump right in, though, for our first-time GoToWebinar users, let's take a moment and familiarize ourselves with the GoToWebinar interface. You'll notice for today's gathering, our audience is muted for your listening convenience. And whether you are joining us from a desktop or on a mobile device, please take a moment to identify the question mark icon on your screen, as this will allow you to submit comments and questions throughout today's broadcast. And today's broadcast features a full panel discussion. The panel will be followed by a short Q&A session, and I highly encourage you to submit questions at any time during today's discussion. Any questions we cannot accommodate live, we will ensure they are addressed following today's event. And immediately following today's broadcast, you'll receive our event survey, which actually by joining in today's event, you should see that survey link in your chat box right now. And this short survey requests your feedback on today's events, our panelists, a few questions from the panelists for you, and the option to request introductions to our panelists. And our team and our panelists are grateful for your input on all these fronts. So without further delay, please allow me to introduce Kilty Mahoney, who is joining us to open today's event. Hey, Kilty.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome to today's event on charting the state of cybersecurity. I'm Kilty Mahoney, Managing Director with ShareNett Securities. Over the past year, we've certainly witnessed a revolution of innovation and increased reliance on our digital infrastructure. And central to this is cybersecurity, all while the media continues to highlight data breaches, new risks to consumers and infrastructure, and other cyber threats that have implications for international relations, as well as national security. So today, for our fourth event of 2021, we're going to take a deeper dive into the current state of cybersecurity in the US with an eye to its future. But first, as a brief refresher, I'll explain who we are. ShareNett is a private, members-only platform of professional investors, founded, designed, and owned by family offices, for family offices, to facilitate peer-to-peer investing in unique, highly curated opportunities. Our membership is diverse by design, powering a global network of approximately 400 families. We continue to welcome new members to enhance our platform, deal sourcing, and diligence capabilities, and thank you very much for joining us today. So now let's turn to today's main event. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jason Gale, Managing Partner of Cyber Capital Partners. Jason has spent nearly 20 years advising government agencies and national labs, universities and accelerators alongside investors, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders on the challenges and opportunities that comprise the cybersecurity ecosystem. Jason, you'll discover, is a bit of a futurist and will be moderating a provocative discussion among three incredible individuals who have each worked deep within the federal government's cyber leadership and now bring their expertise and innovation to the private sector. Like you, I'm excited to hear what's ahead for American companies, entrepreneurs, and investors. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me turn it over to you to frame today's discussion.
Thank you, Kilty. Yeah, we are very excited to be here today. Thank you to ShareNett and Cavendish for hosting today's event. We certainly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to the audience participants. Your time is valuable, and we intend to honor that by providing an informative, brief presentation, followed by an engaging conversation that lays out the problems, the solution set, and the opportunities ahead. When we formed Cyber Capital Partners as an investment sub-advisor and management consultancy in 2010, cybersecurity was a nascent term, let alone industry. Today, we have reached the end of the beginning. The market understands the basic concepts. Most boards and executives have had many conversations around protecting the corporation's brand and reputation, the customer's data, and the bottom line. Our lawmakers and regulatory bodies have legislated industry's role and responsibilities in this field of cybersecurity. Cyber is big business. The national annual spend in 2019 was estimated at $156 billion. Gartner tells you that by 2027, cybersecurity will be a $500 billion a year business. The recently passed COVID Relief Act and the upcoming infrastructure bill are likely to add hundreds of billions of dollars in federal spend to these estimates. However, if we pull the camera back and look at the role and influence that cybersecurity has had in our country's, or has in our country's next 20 years, we see that the concept of cybersecurity has only started to mature. In the 20 years after 9/11, the United States spent $6.4 trillion on war and counterterrorism. What will our reaction be to a hypothetical cyber war? The public-private partnership between the defense industrial base expands dramatically when we include cybersecurity. Our conversation today is intended to look forward at the interdependency of our government and industry to protect our most essential operations, to improve the United States military strength and our national competitive position on trade and innovation. In reality, it's a conversation about reseeding American dominance. Daniel Day-Lewis's famous speech in the movie There Will Be Blood centers around telling the owner of an oil field an analogy, that the oil field is a milkshake. Mr. Day-Lewis's character takes a straw, reaches across, and drinks his milkshake, draining the oil field dry. Well, they say data is the new oil. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others are reaching across the oceans on fiber optic lines, breaking into our networks, pilfering our data, and drinking our milkshake. We can see the 16 critical infrastructure sectors named by the Department of Homeland Security. Any compromises in the reliability of these sectors severely weakens the United States as a global economic force and military power. Every major war is won by disrupting the enemy's supply chain. Over the past 13 months, the United States has faced major threats to these sectors. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, our healthcare and public health sector is overwhelmed. Even in the best of times, the United States reinvestment in infrastructure is woefully behind. Earlier this year, a significant storm hit Texas and threatened the food supply chain and energy grid, resulting in 57 deaths. Our nuclear energy is built on legacy devices and code that was never designed for cybersecurity. Our supply chain for much that we are dependent upon is in China and other parts of Asia. Our dependency on this concept of just-in-time logistics means that we would wait months for new motors, generators, and transformers to arrive from South Korea after a widespread attack on the US energy grid. The recent Russian SolarWinds Microsoft hack was followed by China's Microsoft attack, which both aimed at corporations across these critical infrastructure sectors and the US government. The military war games and diplomatic relationships continue to intensify as we see President Biden in heated exchanges with both countries 86 days into his presidency. The cyber war is hypothetical. The United States is entering the second phase of our national cybersecurity rollout. Though the US has understood the need for securing our network of computers since 1972, it was only in the mid-2000s that a national program began to take shape. The NSA ran US Cyber Command, but the nomenclature was still network security and information assurance. Cybersecurity wasn't a common term. The NSA and US leadership initially only required military agencies to harden their cyber posture. A few years later, added were the civilian agencies and the largest enterprises of healthcare and financial services. In October 2010, US Cyber Command was spun out from the NSA. The government made clear that it was unable to defend the country against attacks on private industry. Over the next decade, the enterprises and medium-sized businesses face growing cyber regulations and compliance costs. With this year's start of the CMMC compliance program for the defense industrial base, it's the first time that US small businesses must meet these requirements. We anticipate that this small business rollout repeats the pattern established before, first with the defense industrial base, and then requiring full participation across all 16 sectors. Returning to the concerns for our national security supply chain, the US government is fully aware of these challenges. Unlike the consolidated command and control under the dictatorships of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the United States has at best a fragmented, decentralized power over the states and businesses controlling our critical industries. As a result, The U.S. asks for voluntary participation by the private industry of these sectors. The Department of Homeland Security sub-agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, formed public-private partnerships to prevent and reduce the risks of disruption to our national supply chain. On CISA's website, the government spells out its dependency and has created coordinating councils in each sector. The second act of our national cybersecurity rollout is the maturing of these partnerships and the full participation by all entities within these sectors. Today's panel will discuss the role of industry, the financial, operational, and technical challenges for industry, the federal government's role of funding innovation in cybersecurity R&D, and assuring that the new solutions do not introduce new vulnerabilities into the supply chain. We ask you as the audience to consider what is your role as industry leaders, where are we going, and what opportunities exist to profit from this next wave of cybersecurity. Kilty, back to you.
Great, thanks, Jason. With that, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. First is JC Hertz, who is currently COO of Ion Channel, a cybersecurity platform that allows organizations to risk manage and provide continuous and automatic security assurance around their software code. She's a highly regarded veteran of the defense and intelligence communities, having served as a White House special consultant and having advised the Pentagon and the Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency. JC is also recognized for authoring key parts of the Pentagon's cybersecurity acquisition and procurement policies. She also co-leads a Commerce Department working group on software bills of material to facilitate supply chain transparency in critical infrastructure and regulated industry.
It's good to be here.
Welcome, JC. Next, I'm also pleased to introduce Sean Planke, who just finished up his term as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the U.S. Department of Energy and is currently Director of Cyber Missions at DataRobot. At CSER, Sean led energy sector engagement, preparedness, and response activities, including overseeing the $95 million R&D budget for cyber and physical security for the U.S. energy sector. Before joining the DOE, Sean served on the National Security Council as Director for Maritime and Pacific Cybersecurity Policy. He has also served as Global Cyber Intelligence Advisor for British Petroleum and as the Deputy Chief Information Officer for U.S. Navy Intelligence. Welcome, Sean. And rounding out the panel is Cliff Trifted. Cliff is a senior cybersecurity industry expert, having spent more than 30 years advising the federal government and the largest U.S. corporations across aerospace and defense, manufacturing and tech, utilities and communications, and oil and gas. A West Point grad with a master's in computer science, Cliff spent the first decade of his career in the cyber defense and operations of U.S. nuclear command and control systems. Over his post-military career, he led the transformation of GM's manufacturing, was CIO of Baker Hughes, and Vice President and General Manager of Motorola Global Systems. Cliff was selected as Presidential Executive Fellow by the Obama administration to help remediate systemic cybersecurity risk across the federal government. He's currently Executive Director for Cybersecurity and Risk Management at Kearney, consulting with governments and major industries on the changing landscape of technology and cyber threats. He also provides technical, strategic direction for StealthPath, a zero-trust cybersecurity and operations integrity product and services company. Welcome, Cliff, and thank you, everyone. And now, Jason, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kilty, again. Well, Pan, I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion here. There are multiple dynamics within industry that make for particular challenges in the field of cybersecurity. Let's explore some of these. Cliff, within the security team, turnover and access to quality human capital is a major issue. The average tenure of a chief information security officer is about 26 months. We've seen organizations struggle to staff their cyber personnel. How do we deal with the labor force challenge?
Well, I think the labor force challenge is one of the bigger challenges currently facing us in cybersecurity. We're looking at a major labor shortage. I mean, when I joined the government, we saw that we were just in the federal government forecasting over 1 million people in the US over the next almost 48 months. You take a look at it on a global level, we're talking about 3.5 million unfilled positions. And this is really causing a problem and a demand for talent, and even the assessment of what talent we have, and it's driving up the salary of this security professional. And what this is really forcing us to do is look at solutions that are perhaps less complicated, because we're just not going to get the fully skilled person, and we're going to become more reliant on automated tools, again, because of the shortage of personnel. Back to
And
you.
Jason,
Just
what
to
do you
echo
see as-
that,
Yeah.
I think that when we have too little talent and we have a huge job, that's when we start to see the need for automation, right? And this is where a lot of the innovation goes, right? Is if you have a ditch and people are busy digging it with spoons, you need some self-driving earth-moving equipment. And I think that's what a lot of the companies like StealthPath and Ion Channel and others are endeavoring to do now. And this is the opportunity, is there's never going to be enough labor. Well, you can pray and light many candles. It will not come. And so we now need to start thinking about how to automate and modernize some of these processes so that they can move at machine speed, and so that we can close the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. And the tighter and the faster we can make those loops, the more responsive and resilient we can be.
Sean, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just think back to when we think about like when I was starting my cybersecurity, everything was about like what's going on, like what's on the network. We had no visibility, like we didn't know, and so we built all these capabilities that were about getting awareness. And now we just created, now we have a lot of awareness in most areas. It's just that, but the fire hose is just hitting that side. Like if you look at the federal contract spend right now, all of the predicted contracts in 21 are majority of them are about busting seats, right? More people in the sky, and that's because we're overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed with the data set. So moving to SOC 2.0, 3.0 DART, we have to move to that artificial machine learning, triage, auto route, or alerts.
Hey, Sean, we're having a little bit of issues with your microphone. You want to tap it a little bit and maybe that will help it?
Sure. Yeah.
Much
Better?
improved. Yeah, you want to tell us that again?
That was weird. Yeah, so I was just saying, like, everything was about getting all the data, right? Originally, getting awareness, right? Getting network flow, net flow, getting alerting, understanding what was going on. And now that we understand, or we don't have 100% visibility, but we have better visibility, now we're just overloaded. And I was just saying, if you look at like federal contract predictions for 21, the majority of them are asking for more butts in seats because they're overloaded with those alerting. And I mean, they're just not getting to the alerts that are coming up, and we're not being responsive. So there's two ways you can go there. One, you can either be preventative and try to do things in your architecture and your design that reduces the number of alerts that you'll even see, or two, you need to automate and bring machine learning and AI into your response side of the house. So those are the two paths that we have to start walking down.
I think that there's an analogy to logistics, right? So when you want to know where your package is, FedEx doesn't call around to see where it is and daisy chain between people. There's a system in place that's instrumented that gives you transparency. And so if you look at some of these hacks, if you look at Pinellas County, right? So now we're talking about health and safety with water quality and things that are toxic, possibly working their way into the water supply. In this case, there was a human being who was watching cursor move around on the screen. And if the hacker had been just a little bit better, that wouldn't have worked. And so when we start to talk about instrumenting our systems, this is really the next generation of having enough visibility and transparency on our operations as well as on our supply chain to be aware, to take action, and to be accountable for what's going on.
So, JC, whether we're talking about the manufacturer or the prime government contractor, the organization's cybersecurity posture is really dependent upon its subcontractors and its vendors. Can you share with us what can be done to improve the security risks coming from our teaming partners?
Right. So we're moving in from, the old hacks. It used to be a guy with a thumb drive, right? And then it was a DNS attack. And now it's stuff that's coming in through the supply chain. And there has been a huge amount of focus through a couple of administrations on supply chain, starting with, ICT and telecom. And there's an executive order that is impending about supply chain transparency. In the domain where I work, which is software supply chain transparency, there's both a regulatory push and a market pull for things like software bills and materials, right? So that's like the food ingredients label. What is in your product? And no one debates that food safety is important, right? And we're starting to agree that this label needs to be there, and that we actually need to monitor the vulnerability status of what's in there. In terms of regulatory push, we have executive action. There's also legislative mandates. And also, the FDA just mandated if you want approval for a medical device on a go-forward basis, you need a software bill of materials. So now this is billions of dollars. And so we're working now with manufacturers like, Abbott and Philips and Thermo Fisher and Medtronic to figure out what does it mean to produce one of these things. And then on the consumer sides, the hospital systems, what does it mean to consume them and to monitor them? And so we're all going into this kind of trust but verify regime where before you relied on a supplier to inform you that there was a vulnerability, but don't worry, we've patched it, but that's not good enough anymore. So a bank, before it will procure any software product, the big banks will say, okay, give us a software bill of materials, and if you can't, we won't buy your product, or we'll immediately demand a 40% discount to reflect the increased cost of assurance. And then they'll monitor that. So the supplier now knows, oh, geez, the customer is going to know when there's a critical vulnerability in a component that we're using. And then we might be held to a security service level agreement. So not only do they know, the customer now says, like Mayo Clinic, well, if you pop a critical in your device, you got 30 days to fix it. And if you don't, here's some remedies in our contract. And this is where it becomes very real to suppliers and very real to the investors in those suppliers. And so the transparency allows a whole new regime of third-party risk management, procurement, and vendor management, because cyber is now a part of third-party risk management. And on a company level, we're working on some highly differentiated technologies and business models to automate that compliance, which we'll look forward to discussing further at a later date.
Yeah, I think I definitely like where JC was going, and it's spot on with everything you're saying. The thing that I think about on top of that is if I'm an organization, if I'm a Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 company, I think to myself, like, am I organized the right way to even capitalize on that, right? I was thinking a lot of the organizations I worked in, the CISO reported to the CIO, who reported to the CFO, but the CISO would be called in to present to the board and to the CEO level, and the CISO wants that assurance, right? Wants that compliance that we're talking about, but the CIO wants things cheaper and faster, and the CFO definitely wants things cheaper. So when we think about security, which is neither fast and not always cheap, right? It's diametrically opposed to the wants of your boss. I mean, I think to go back to the first point Cliff was saying, like, that's why CISOs leave after 18 months, right? Like they say, hey, we need to make these changes. We want to move in this direction, and it's like, that's not cheap or fast enough. There
is a point though with certain kinds of agility where good and fast does become cheap. So if you have a high-speed engineering team, I think we're going to start to see customers rack and stack their suppliers by their security response time, right? So mean time to remediation, when something goes wrong, how long does it take these guys to fix it? And if you have data on that, you can start to rack and stack your suppliers on their response time. It costs those fast responders less to respond than it costs the slow responders to respond because of all their legacy, which Cliff will get into in a second.
Yeah.
And this is
And
what
that
we're going to
means you have-
learn.
Yeah, I just want to build on, I think, a real important point that, you talked about. I saw a couple of things here I just want to build on, but one of the big challenges I usually get asked to participate or consult on, whether that be a government or a Fortune 1, is the problem's so big. I only have so much money. I only have so much time. Where do I start? How do I focus? And it really comes down to a little bit of sorting. And the first thing you got to sort on, what's really important? What are the core business processes I need to support? And then from that, which are those critical suppliers and what is it if they do that I have to prioritize? And then I really need to wrap around the protections. Now, when I was General Motors, Fortune 1, and I had this kind of accountability, I couldn't go to the board and say, one of my little suppliers failed. No, it was on me. And so I think this is the other thing. The larger corporations are going to be accountable. I mean, we're already seeing in legislation, you can't go point at some guy down the food chain that that's why and all the liability should fall on them. No, they start with the big guy and they work down. And I think as a big guy at General Motors, I went to my supply chain, which varied greatly depending on who they were and where we were in the world. What was the risk? And then I had to figure out a risk mitigation strategy. Usually it started off with an isolation strategy, but it also meant I need to have more visibility into my supply chain. What was the risk in there? And how could I extend my visibility in there without causing harm or risk to their operations? So that challenge that existed a number of years ago is even more so today.
And it's moving into software as well, right? So that software bill of materials that, our customers in finance and healthcare are now asking for, this is pre-procurement. So they'll kick over a software bill of materials to us and we'll analyze it. And they can have a conversation with their supplier or that sales guy to say, okay, we love your product. The CIO is crazy about it. But from a security perspective, this is not ready for prime time and we are not willing to assume this kind of risk. So in order to speed time to sale here, you're going to want to bring this up to code and keep it. And that's the basis of an ongoing conversation now, which actually makes things easier from the CISO perspective, from the security perspective, to have that gating function right at the edge of an organization pre-procurement, because once it's brought up to code, then you can monitor to say it stays in code. And third-party risk management, which is a really kind of boring corner of enterprise, is now becoming like the hot spot because this is the velvet rope for cyber.
I'll agree with that statement. I mean, certainly we've seen time and time again where the compliance piece is the victory as opposed to the security piece. Sean, the system is so busy responding to incidents that they rarely have time to see organized R&D. They're dealing with their own organization's advancements of their own code, right? And so they're not out there looking at new technologies. Or doing continuous training. So you headed the Department of Energy Cybersecurity R&D. I'd love to hear about that. And then I'd also love to hear about, how do you get your technologies into the hands of the private sector?
Sure. So a couple different thoughts. Right off the bat, when we were at Caesar, I thought a lot about where is the least served, and the reason that we thought about this was a lot of times when people think of security, they want to secure the president, right? They want to secure the CEO of the company, the head shed office, and I always go back to, I'm like, sure, that person's valuable, but who has the key to every room in the building? The janitor does, right? So the access point, if you want to, let's say to use a cyber term, gain root access, right, is to go through the super user, which is the janitor, right? So when we think about the electric grid, the energy sector, who actually has a large swath of access, but not that much security? And we thought about the municipalities, right? The electric and water providers that provide large swaths of distribution of electricity across America, right? So like, for instance, in San Francisco, the municipality actually provides all the water and all the electricity to all the residents and businesses in San Francisco. LA is the same way, right? So think about that. Those are massive, massive amounts of millions and millions of people, and they're actually provided by municipalities. So knowing how we pay teachers and school systems and how we fund them, we're always saying, no, I don't want to pay any more taxes. Well, if the taxes are paying the municipality and it's a rate controlled, and it's also a rate controlled environment, like, do you think that, you know, you're buying that top tier cybersecurity investment? You're not. And generally, I used to use this analogy all the time. The guy that mows the lawn on Fridays is also your IT guy, who's also your cyber guy.
Right.
So when we think about that, that's where we started. We said, hey, we need to think about R&D that serves that guy, because that's the back door to the greater electric grid and to have mass effects on millions of Americans. So we look for solutions there, and that drove us to, you know, what type of capabilities were we thinking of? Well, if you look at the ransomware attacks in America that have happened in municipalities, you know, many of them, the network is a very flat network. So you have IT systems and OT systems on the same network. So thinking about that convergence and saying, how can we provide autonomous or let's say self-defending R&D solutions that can self-segregate or provide barriers against the IT and the OT environments from converging, so that an action on one doesn't impact the other. Trying to provide some level of isolation and resiliency. We thought a lot about, you know, how can we have deployable solutions that don't need a constant connectivity, a constant update, that don't need or need minimal man on the loop, right? Human on the loop to self-sustain and to protect themselves. And like in the municipality, we recognize, like, they can't necessarily defend themselves against the APTs of, you know, Russia or China, but can they at least throw an alert or help the municipality provider in the state or the National Guard or, you know, CISA, DHS and CISA say, throw an alert and say, hey, I need some help here, right? Like, I'm reaching a consequence level that's going to have a significant impact on my populace. Can I throw a flag and say, guys, come check on me, render assistance, right? Render aid.
Well, and also leverage, Sean. I mean, I just met with like 50 rural telcos, and their biggest complaint was, yeah, we know there's vulnerabilities in the vendor solutions, but when our little tiny telco says that they should fix it, they tell us to pound sand. So
Right.
I think that when you start to get some of this supply chain transparency and the larger customers and some of the regulators are requiring that this stuff get patched, I think there's a whole bunch of municipal benefit as well, because, you know, they don't just patch the product for the big customer. And so as we achieve these levels of supply chain transparency, I mean, a lot of these municipalities, some of them have really good people and they know there's problems and they have no leverage. So the revolution in procurement and, you know, different kinds of transparency, and I think we mentioned the industry ISACs, the Information Security and Analysis Centers, and ISALs, right? Those become really important, because when these regulated sectors start to speak with one voice about the need to not have critically vulnerable open source components in vendor solutions, and that's a procurement issue, that's when stuff starts to change.
Yeah, I
So-
just want to on that, if I could. I had the opportunity to participate in a couple of different ISACs. I participated in oil and gas and also the health industry. And I think back to Jason's original question is, how do we get the information out there? I saw it in two different ways that haven't been addressed. You take a look at the smaller agencies. There's about 200 agencies in the federal government, and there's about 20 that are of sizable size with CIO and security staffs and all that. And what I found is the smaller agencies, they weren't getting the word either. The larger agencies perhaps have labs, the technology gets into the labs, but how do we get it to the rest of the people? And so what we have to do is, the people trying to get the technology, and I was called by a number of senators saying, hey, how do we get our technology into the federal government? Well, the first place is the labs. And then the government itself has to figure out how to share among itself to the smaller agencies. So we were when I was there, I was looking to be like a foster parent to Justice and some other groups to help share with them and bring them into that communications loop. So I still think there's a weakness in the federal government of sharing to the smaller agencies. But the ISACs is a great way that, JC mentioned for that sharing between the government and industry. And it's two-way. The industry kind of communicates the reality check. This is what we can do. Okay, this is what we need from you in order to do what you're asking of us. And sometimes they take leadership. I know oil and gas was trying to take leadership and communicate up. The health was more like looking for guidance and wanting to be more informed. But when I would sit in an oil and gas ISAC, it was really a team sport. We had Homeland Security there, we had FBI, local law enforcement, and we were sharing in real time attack information, intelligence, and such. And it was super valuable. And the same thing was taking place in the health industry. So it's one of the best places for that two-way exchange to take place. And the most effective are two-way exchanges. They're not just from the government, but they're from this private sector going to the government of the feasibility and needs of their particular industry.
And the industries, they share amongst themselves as well. I mean, we see, some of the health provision organizations that we're engaged with, which, by the way, have much more stringent security requirements than any government agency or even military program. I would stack the Mayo Clinic up against any weapon system any day. But they're looking at, what is the vulnerability profile of these devices, right? Because they're exposed. They have patients and their families and all their devices walking the hallways. They have no physical access control, right? Imagine that. They don't have gates and guards, right? They have to let everyone in. And so their level of vigilance and the amount of data that's now starting to be shared both within the ISACs and then just in some of these proof of concepts and it's very constructive, right? They'll go to a big medical device manufacturer and say, okay, confidentially, here's our findings, and how do we work together to address this? But the enterprise now, whether it's a healthcare or energy, oil and gas, like you say, they own the risk. And they're not, the smart ones are not waiting necessarily to start to get their heads around what that means on a rolling basis. And like you said, it's a team sport. There needs to be collaboration. But from what we've seen in, the very smart financial services, healthcare, energy, transportation, our customers, they're not the people who are going to have, yeah, we're from the government, we're here to help. They are on it. They are deeply engaged right now. And so there actually is a lot of traction right now on information sharing. And I think there's a lot of hope. And it looks complicated and hairy and gnarly, and it is. But that also means there's huge opportunity if you're taking the right approach and if you're using, your talent wisely and automating instead of just putting butts in seats.
So Sean,
real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about two ways, like the inside baseball of how that's actually going to get done with the federal government right now. To reinforce the same things that Cliff and JC are saying, the government is doing a few different things. And when I was at DOE, we started this. We started an effort to put an MOU between us and EPA. And why EPA? Well, EPA is the sector-specific agency under PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 21, for providing the security to water facilities around America, right? Wastewater and drinking water. All EPA is supposed to do that. Well, EPA has 6 people that are there to do cyber. 6, right? So they don't really serve the 4,000 municipalities that are out in America in that regard. They just don't have the capacity. But they still have the responsibility in the accountability under PPD 21. The president has said that, and that's from 2013, right? So 2 things are happening. One is the White House has recognized that PPD 21 is now approaching 10 years old. Things have changed. We need to rewrite. They're rewriting it right now. It's going to come out that instead of sector-specific agencies, they're sector risk-specific agencies now, and it's focused more on the risk aspect, and that builds off of the National Risk Management Center concept that sits inside of CISA. And they say, well, now we're going to start mandating more of what these agencies will engage with. Like, what is CISA going to do versus what is Cybercom going to do versus what are the 16 critical sectors going to have responsibilities and have to do. And they recognize that a lot of that falls on the states. Like Cliff said, the smaller agencies and the state and at the state level or regional level that the federal government just doesn't see. So the thought process right now is, how do we get that funding distributed out? Like, how do we get, you know, the massive infrastructure funding distributed out? And it's actually looked at about using post 9/11. We did port security grants and we did counterterrorism grants for security around America. Now that's how you see that, you know, small town Kansas actually has an MRAP for their PD.
As
but
one
the
does.
concept of how do we distribute the funding levels down is through these federal public-private partnership grant programs, right? That's how the money is going to be dispersed. And so DHS is already currently working on the criteria for the cybersecurity grant program, saying X amount of this grant application has to include cybersecurity. We want it to be focused on these criteria, some of which were mentioned, you know, by JC and Cliff today. That's the methodology that they're looking at about how do we help the rest of the community start to protect the critical sectors.
And there's some lessons learned. So I co-chair a Department of Commerce group on software transparency. And so one of the lessons learned is that, you know, the US government has a lot of experience doling out money to build things that are innovative, but then are unmaintainable, right? Because they were built as R&D and there was never any funding to actually maintain them on a rolling basis. And as I like to say, software ages like milk, not like fine wine. So the minute you stop maintaining it, it starts to crumble from underneath you. And so part of the new and hopefully lesson learned is that we have to have these capabilities that build resilience, not just more attack surface. Because if we start doling out tens of billions of dollars to build great innovation, but there's no way to make sure that it's actively maintained, we're just building more attack surface. And so it's not a capital good. It is a variable cost. So we actually have to fund resilience, not just innovation, and make sure that our capabilities are kept green instead of being allowed to just corrode.
So we've gone through some kind of time warp here and have reached, you know, about 30 minutes of panel really quickly. You know, let's move it into the wrap-up phase of the role of the U.S. investor. You know, what should the audience take away as a call to action, JC?
So the investor on a private sector basis, I think that we really have to start to think about cyber due diligence as part of our due diligence, because I don't think there's a lot of people who want to be, you know, principal investors in, you know, the next SolarWinds.
Right.
And we can hold those companies to account. I think on the US, on the government side, there's a real calculus that has to go into sort of build versus buy, and that the government is realizing how expensive build can be when it takes, a team of, 20 defense contractors to maintain it. It's not so inexpensive. So I think from private investors, we really have to think much more seriously about holding our portfolio companies to account. And then on a public sector level, we really have to start building some security level agreements for service into our capabilities to make sure the people who maintain them are keeping us from being exposed.
Cliff, did you want to add thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the first one is security's not optional. It's now almost like breathing for a corporation. You're going to have to put in security. You're going to have to think about it for operational integrity. The other thing with it comes liability. And that's one of the reasons, even if it wasn't just for keep my factory open, it's the liability it might represent in terms of safety or anything else that we see, privacy. There's so many more laws and governance coming out about that. And this is where that partnership between government and private sector becomes very critical. And I think the last piece I want to put out is, we still have that talent issue that I kind of opened up with, that these solutions have to be near real time because cyber moves at the speed of light, and they have to be similar and more intuitive and capable of themselves, which brings us back into the application of things like behavioral analysis and AI, because we just don't have the talent, the sufficient talent. And even if we had the talent probably be able to respond quick enough. So this is a real opportunity for innovation. The requirements there, the innovation demand is there. And I think you're going to see a continued growth in spending in the area of cybersecurity.
And Sean, did you want to add there?
Yeah. So, if I'm thinking of an investor, right, I want to do, software as a service with a big fat ARR and let it grow, because that's very scalable for me. The problem that I see, like right now, a lot of that investment and that thought process is focused on solutions that are cyber attack happens. What do I do now? Right. It's incident. It's post incident. It's recovery. And the place that it's not in prevention, and it's not in the resiliency aspect that JC talked about, right? So if I'm thinking about, where can I invest and still keep that SaaS model with an ARR, I need to look at things that provide resiliency and or prevent, right? Like I would move out of the incident response market in my
100%, Sean.
Yeah.
So we tell folks all the time when we run the assessments, which we do as SaaS, there's some findings. You're not going to like them for now. There's some things that aren't critical vulnerabilities. They aren't high vulnerabilities. They're not known vulnerabilities yet, but they're absolutely things we should look at, because 6 months from now, that's going to be a vulnerability, right? That's going to be a tooth cavity. And they don't like it when the findings come back. But what we've managed to do is scrub 80% of the vulnerabilities that will happen in the future, so that they're not in fire drill mode. And that's what the smart people are all doing, because the fire drill, the incident response with the talent shortage that we have, it's high stress, it's overwhelming, and it's actually demoralizing. It burns people out. Yep. So if you can actually do this work preventatively, and we're really bad as human beings at doing that, with our health and our cyber health. But if you can enforce it from the top down, that these are risk indicators you got to scrub out, you can save yourself down the line. And we have the technology to do that.
All right. Well, that was awesome, everybody, and definitely appreciate your insights there. Ian, are there any questions that as we move to open Q&A?
Thanks, Jason, and absolutely, we do have time for a couple of questions here in the few minutes that we do have. As a reminder to the audience, you can submit them by clicking that question mark icon on your screen. Anything we can't get to right now, we will make sure that those questions are answered after today's broadcast. And jumping back to Sean, one question. President Biden keeps emphasizing the need for expanding federal R&D. We know that there exists a high demand for these technologies. Why is it so hard for government to deploy these technologies? And also, what are the goals for assisting agencies in discovery to security? Can you briefly comment on that?
Sure. And actually, this is a great one for Jason to talk about too. But one of the problems is technology. Yeah, everything dies in the chasm, right? And you think about technology adoption. We would fund a lot of basic and/or applied research to develop a technology, and then the government. When I came in, my office was supposed to speak externally. I'm like, where is our CMO, right? Where is our chief marketing officer? I wanted to hire, and I actually wrote out this whole thing about hiring a CMO. We need somebody whose job is to get the word out, to liaison with the private sector. And instead, the concept that we had was, oh, we'll have policy people, and on their free time, they'll set up events and go to and arrange the SEC meetings that we were talking about, Cliff. But that's not their skill set, and that's why you see, the government is notorious for running on PowerPoint and putting out terrible graphics, and their answer to having to working with the private sector is to give some random email box or a phone number that you never know who is on the other end of answering the call, right? The pivot that we need to make as we generationally change in the federal government, which is what we're doing right now, right? The average age of a federal employee is 57. So as the new generation comes in, we need to utilize technology to bring in a marketing component to get across that gap, because the technologies that we create turn into shelfware where it's a great product.
And Sean, though, the one of the other reasons they turn into shelfware, apart from lack of marketing, is lack of engineering. So I think we have researchers who are PhDs who are wonderful at creating these really inspiring demos, right? They show the way, but they are not products, and they cannot perform at scale. And there's only a few companies in the world, there's a few dozen companies in the world that really understand what it means to perform at scale. Like we had to provide services to a huge intelligence agency. So scale was just table stakes day one. And that took 4 years to scale up to industrial grade. And like my chief engineer says, you can't just get a bunch of developers together, right? When you want to build a bridge, you don't just take a bunch of bricks and stack them up by the river, right? You need engineering for that. And I think that there's this Silicon Valley myth of we'll just do MVP and we'll be on Mountain Dew and no-dos and come up with something, it'll be awesome. But we really need engineering for things that are going to scale. And I think that is the bigger gap than lack of marketing, because you do this great marketing on stuff that's just demoware, you're going to have a lot of disappointed people. Well, so I think having that product test passed is important.
I just think I gotta double down on what Sean said. When I was in the federal government, I saw huge opportunities. I mean, the resources of the federal government and so forth are outstanding. But I even found organizations like Homeland Security who couldn't deploy their own stuff. Okay, because one of the big challenges is Sean's point, they don't know how to communicate. Okay, I mean, I went to the Hill and talked to the budget committees and so forth, and they said, "Here, Cliff, you can have all the money you freaking want." I mean, we've never heard anybody actually tell us why they want the money. Okay, they just want the money, and since we don't know why, we don't give it to you. So since they communicate so poorly, they don't have the resources, they don't have the talent, the staff, or even the money to do anything in advance. I mean, they're just, like you said, trying to keep the milk fresh. Okay, and they fail at that. So let alone go buy some wine. That is not going to happen. So if they can't learn to communicate and put it into some kind of mission statement, how it relates back to the mission, they're not going to get it. This isn't unique to the government. I mean, corporations have exactly the same problem. But how to communicate the value, not only today, but tomorrow, because they do live a little bit today. And you have to put your problem statement in today and tomorrow and help put that business case for them, because they cannot communicate. They make lousy PowerPoints. They don't know how to get in the minds of the audience.
Well, and they're also trying to figure out how to fund FTEs, right? So if the procurement model is how do we maximize the number of defense contractors and integrators on task, you're not going to get a high scale solution, right? It's perverse, right? It's no way incentivized. So I think we have to look at the productization of things, and like Sean said, right? You want a SaaS that scales, and you want to see ARRs, and you want to see things where if customers aren't happy, they can switch, right? Because that tells you that a market can actually work. And so I think that figuring out how to buy versus necessarily make everything from scratch, which we'd love to do in the federal government, that's really important. How do we build on success?
All right, so let me hop in real quick here. Certainly that topic is one where this panel, and myself included, could go on for hours on that particular topic. Certainly part of Cyber Capital Partners is to participate in the DoD Trusted Capital Marketplace as a cybersecurity venture firm. And the reason we do that is there is enormous gaps between the government and industry, and that need to facilitate that public-private partnership is really a core mission of Cyber Capital Partners. We're at 12:57. I'm mindful of our audience's time. I want to hand it over to Ian and have him do the wrap up, but I please ask everybody, fill out the survey. It will be very helpful for us, and it will be a pathway for us to get a chance to talk with you guys as well. So thank you very much to the panel. Great insights. I think you guys are all brilliant, and looking forward to working with you guys again in the near future here. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you to everybody, JC, Sean, Cliff, thank you all. We've got more questions that we can answer. Obviously, there's a lot of interest around this, and we'll keep those conversations going after today's event. And just as a broader reminder to our audience, today's broadcast is being recorded, and a copy will be made available on request. And I highly, highly encourage you, as Jason just said, to complete the event survey, which we will be sending in an email this afternoon. And I'm going to be once again bringing back now our colleague Kilty Mahoney for closing remarks.
Thanks again, Ian. As we close today from ShareNett, huge thank you to Jason, JC, Sean, and Cliff. Fantastic panel. And thank you to Cavendish Global, our monthly event partner, for helping us to produce today's event. Please, everyone, save the date for our upcoming ShareNett Cavendish events, including next Thursday, April 22nd, when we have Charlie Hammerman presenting on his nonprofit work through the Disability Opportunity Fund, and also on Wednesday, May 19th. Please join ShareNett right back here for our next panel event with a new focus on consumer technology. Look for the RSVP links that will be heading over to your inbox, and we hope to see you there. Hope you've enjoyed today's event. Huge thank you again to all who participated for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.